October's cold dusk lingered in the air, sending shivers through anyone brave enough to venture out alone. The small village at the foot of Black Hill had lived with whispered legends for generations. Stories passed down about a shadow that prowled the hill's dense, ancient woods, a creature that, they claimed, emerged under a Halloween moon. But few truly believed it. Few dared to acknowledge those legends until October arrived and the wind carried an eerie chill that rattled the townsfolk. Among those in the village who harbored a quiet fascination with the hill's mysteries was Emily Morrow, a young woman known for her curiosity and reckless courage. That evening, as the village prepared for its annual Halloween festivities, she overheard an old man at the pub recounting the tale of the creature that haunted Black Hill. A wolf, but not just a wolf, he said, his voice a tremor of fear and thrill. Bigger, with eyes that pierced the night. You don't need to see it to know it's there, you can feel it, watching. Emily was intrigued. The old man's tale stirred a thrill in her, a hunger to uncover the truth behind the whispers. As the village settled into its Halloween revelries, she slipped away, clutching a small lantern. She made her way to the path leading up Black Hill, her heartbeat mingling with the crunch of autumn leaves beneath her boots. The deeper she ventured into the woods, the thicker the shadows grew, twisting around her like dark vines. Yet, something caught her attention, impressions in the ground, larger than any creature she knew of in the area. These were tracks, deep and deliberate, as if marking a path to something concealed by the trees. Without hesitation, Emily followed, her every step pulling her further into the dark and the strange. As the night wore on, her path brought her to a strange rock formation at the edge of a steep incline. The smell of damp earth grew stronger, and a hollow seemed to emerge from the shadows. At first, it appeared as an outcrop of stone, but as her eyes adjusted, Emily saw the jagged mouth of a cave she'd never seen before. It was too large, too dark, as if it swallowed light rather than reflected it. Taking a breath, Emily stepped closer, feeling the weight of silence pressing in. Then, without warning, a faint but unmistakable sound echoed from the depths of the cave, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her hand trembled as she lifted her lantern higher, but the light barely penetrated the darkness. A gust of wind swept past, carrying with it a series of distant howls, each one growing louder and more urgent. Emily's breath caught as she realized they weren't coming from one direction. They were surrounding her, circling, closing in. She had no idea how long she stood there, frozen. But when she dared to look back toward the village, she felt a primal terror, a sense that she was being watched, hunted. Her heart pounded as the howls grew louder, blending into the wind's chilling whisper. Something shifted in the darkness, an outline of something large and unfathomable. Before she could turn to run, Emily's lantern flickered and went out, leaving her alone with only the distant, haunting cries that echoed across the hill. The extinguished lantern left Emily surrounded by a blackness so dense it seemed to close around her, as though the night itself had taken form. Her breaths were shallow, and each exhale hung in the air like fragile mist before being swallowed by the surrounding void. She strained her eyes, willing them to pierce through the dark, but the shape she had glimpsed was now gone, lost in the layers of shadow that blanketed the hill. She thought of turning back, of retracing her steps through the trees. Yet something in her, a mixture of curiosity and defiance, compelled her to remain. Her feet felt rooted to the spot as if the hill itself had claimed her, demanded her attention. The air was still, unnaturally so, and for a fleeting moment, Emily wondered if she was alone after all, if the howls and shifting shapes had been mere tricks of her imagination. But the silence didn't bring her peace. Instead, it seemed to breathe, pulsing like a heartbeat. Emily forced herself to take a step forward, straining to hear beyond her own footfalls, to catch any sound that might confirm what she felt deep in her bones, that she was not alone. Just then, a distant rustling came from the woods behind her. Her muscles tensed, and she swallowed hard, reminding herself that she was simply following her curiosity, that there was no harm in searching for answers. But the rustling grew closer, more deliberate. Leaves crunched, branches snapped, and as the noises drew near, so did the memory of the village's oldest tales, stories told in hushed tones around fires. She thought of her grandmother, who had lived her whole life in this village, never once leaving Black Hill. She remembered how her grandmother had warned her against exploring the hill at night. Curiosity is a fine thing, she would say, but some secrets prefer to stay buried. As if summoned by that memory, a shape materialized from the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably there, watching. Her heart thundered as she caught sight of a pair of eyes, luminous, wide, and far too knowing. They held a glint of intelligence, but also a hunger, a wildness that felt as old as the stones around her. She couldn't tell if it was merely her own fear that made the creature's eyes seem human, or if something truly unnatural stood before her. Suddenly, the creature turned, disappearing into the dense thicket beside the path, as if beckoning her to follow. Against all reason, Emily took a step forward, feeling the chill of the earth and the weight of centuries-old soil beneath her feet. The trail of large, clawed footprints reappeared before her, stretching out like an invitation she could not ignore. The path led her deeper into the woods, through twists and turns that defied the layout she knew. The landscape around her felt foreign, a place that didn't belong to her or her time. Trees loomed overhead like twisted sentinels, their gnarled branches casting skeletal shapes against the faint moonlight. The air grew colder, sharper, biting against her skin with every step. And still, she pressed on, half dazed and half entranced, as if the darkness itself had a hold on her. Just as she began to lose hope of finding her way back, Emily caught sight of a clearing up ahead. In the center stood an old stone well, covered in vines and moss, its presence a relic of a long-forgotten era. She approached cautiously, noticing that the ground around it was littered with trinkets, small offerings of flowers, coins, and feathers, tokens of respect or perhaps of fear. She reached out a hand, grazing the cool stone, and felt a strange warmth pulse beneath her fingers, as though the well itself was alive, humming with secrets. A sudden gust of wind stirred the air around her, carrying with it a voice, faint, distant, yet unmistakably real. Emily's heart raced, but she couldn't make out the words, only the haunting tone of someone calling from within the well. She pulled her hand away, staring down into the darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly below. And then, just as the last echo faded, she heard it again, the low, mournful howl, closer than before, resonating from the forest around her. Panic surged through her, but she found herself rooted to the spot, drawn to the shadows, to the ancient stone that seemed to hold the answers she sought. Whatever was watching her, lurking just beyond sight, felt impossibly old, bound to the land in ways she couldn't understand. The howls grew louder, each one reverberating through the trees like a warning, a reminder that she was treading where no one was meant to go. In the quiet that followed, she heard a single footstep crunch behind her, heavy and deliberate. The sensation of breath on her neck sent a chill down her spine, and she dared not turn. Instead, she stared into the well, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on her, as though something had followed her here, from a place beyond the reach of light. Emily held her breath, her skin prickling as she fought the urge to look over her shoulder. She could sense the presence behind her, a dense, watchful weight, like a storm pressing down. The silence was too complete, a vacuum broken only by the soft, deliberate rhythm of her own pulse hammering in her ears. With a surge of bravery that surprised even herself, she turned, but found only shadows sprawling across the clearing. Whatever had been there was gone, dissolved into the night as if it had never existed. Yet the feeling remained, a subtle, bone-deep sense that something was watching, something waiting. As she stood alone, Emily became aware of the well's quiet hum, almost like a whisper lulling her into a trance. She approached it again, peering into its depths, unable to see anything but an impenetrable blackness. And yet, she felt drawn to it, as though some unspoken promise lay at the bottom, a key to the mystery surrounding Black Hill. She couldn't explain why her fingers moved toward the stones, or why she leaned over the lip of the well, feeling an insistent pull. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient that prickled in her nostrils and settled in her bones. And then, faintly, a murmur rose from the depths, growing clearer with every passing second. It was a voice, soft but unmistakable, an echo from somewhere far beyond her reach. The words were garbled, like a language she'd once known but had long since forgotten. They spiraled up through the darkness, gaining strength, weaving a strange spell that held her in place. Her hands gripped the stones tightly, as if by instinct, though the smooth surfaces felt unnaturally cold, like frost creeping under her skin. "What are you looking for?" the voice whispered, soft and almost gentle. Emily's heart froze, her lips parting to answer, though she didn't know what words might come out. Before she could speak, the voice continued, rising from the well like smoke, filling the air around her with a chill that seemed to cut through the warmth of her very blood. "They come every year, seeking answers, seeking courage," it murmured. "But courage is fleeting, and answers, they are not for everyone." A shiver coursed through her, and she felt her grip loosen, as if her body recognized some deep danger her mind could not fully comprehend. The words wrapped around her, both taunting and warning, an invitation to step back and leave, or to step forward and discover what lay hidden in the depths of Black Hill's secrets. But before she could respond, another howl split the air, louder and closer than before. This one was unlike the others, layered with an agonized, feral hunger that tore through the quiet, making her heart lurch painfully. She stumbled back from the well, every nerve alert, her mind racing. That sound, she realized, had come from right behind her. She turned, her eyes straining in the dark. The trees cast long, spindly shadows across the clearing, their branches twisting into shapes that seemed to shift and watch her as if alive. She scanned the darkness, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the woods, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, the stillness, the faint echo of that tortured howl. And then, as if in answer to her fear, the ground beneath her feet shivered, just barely, as though something below had moved. She froze, feeling her stomach twist in sudden dread. From deep within the well, a scraping sound emerged, low and methodical, like claws dragging against stone. She felt its weight reverberate through her body, as though the earth itself were bearing witness to something stirring in the black. For a fleeting moment, she thought of the villagers back in the warmth of their homes, shielded from the cold, unknowingly safe from whatever lay in these woods. She thought of her grandmother's warnings, of the hushed voices in the pub, and felt the undeniable weight of those forgotten stories settle upon her shoulders. The scraping grew louder, and she stumbled backward, her pulse hammering as the voice from the well returned, stronger this time, echoing with a resonance that defied distance or time. "You should leave," it said, each word measured and laced with a strange, dark warmth. "They never listen, you know. And they never leave the same." A wave of fear crashed over her, more intense than anything she'd ever felt. And yet, within that fear, a thread of fascination held her in place, rooting her to the spot. She found herself at war with the voice, wanting to flee but somehow compelled to stay, to understand what lurked in the shadows of Black Hill, what secrets the villagers had chosen to forget. The clearing was silent once more. But as she took a step back, her footfall echoed strangely, as though something far below had heard her. A cold, sharp breeze swept through, and as she caught her breath, Emily realized she was no longer alone. From the darkness of the trees, two gleaming eyes appeared, amber and knowing, glinting with an intelligence that sent chills down her spine. The creature, whatever it was, remained still, its gaze locked on hers, as though weighing her, deciding if she was worthy of the truths buried here. And just as quickly as it had come, it vanished into the trees, leaving her trembling, with the echo of that haunting voice still lingering in her ears, whispering a single, haunting phrase, "Do you really want to know?" Emily stood frozen, heart pounding, as the night closed in around her. The clearing felt smaller now, the shadows thicker, almost palpable. She watched the spot where those amber eyes had disappeared, half expecting them to return. But the woods held only silence, as if the night itself had decided to keep its secrets. Summoning her nerve, she turned back toward the path that had brought her here. Yet something in her hesitated, a strange compulsion to stay, to understand what those glinting eyes had seen in her, what the voice in the well had meant with its warning. It was foolish, she told herself, this urge to unravel something that had been deliberately shrouded. And yet the very mystery wrapped around her like a spell, coaxing her deeper into the unknown. She stepped forward, letting her instincts guide her through the clearing and into the thick underbrush. The woods felt different, the air colder, scented with pine and a faint trace of damp earth. Her mind wandered back to the villagers' stories, the ones spoken in hushed tones, always ending with a slight shudder or a furtive glance. The tales of the Black Hill beast that haunted this place each Halloween, lingering long enough to be felt but rarely seen, a phantom that existed in the collective memory of the town but in no one's direct experience. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by a strange sound, a whisper, soft, indistinct, like leaves brushing together. She paused, straining to listen, and realized the sound wasn't coming from the trees but from somewhere closer, somewhere around her. The faint murmuring grew louder, forming fragments of words, nonsensical at first, until one phrase slipped through with chilling clarity. "They're watching." The words sent a chill racing up her spine, but she held her ground. She glanced around, trying to trace the sound, but it seemed to come from every direction, like a chorus of whispers carried by the wind. As her gaze swept over the darkened woods, she noticed something odd, footprints, large and deep, pressed into the damp earth, leading further into the trees. They were unmistakably large, with a shape that suggested something both human and animal. Against her better judgment, she followed, the path winding deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining above her like skeletal fingers. The only light came from the thin sliver of moon that broke through the leaves, casting a silvery glow over the ground. The path twisted and turned, disorienting her, and the trees seemed to close in, as if her very presence was disturbing their ancient stillness. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic murmur that filled her mind. She could barely make out individual words, but certain phrases cut through, sharp and unsettling. "Too close. Not meant to know. Turn back." Yet she pushed forward, her curiosity overpowering the fear tightening in her chest. The footprints led her to a strange clearing where the trees thinned out just enough for her to see the shape of a cave nestled into the hillside. It looked old, forgotten, hidden by thick vines that crawled over its entrance. This was the place no one seemed to remember, the cave that had slipped from the village's memory like a lost dream. A low growl rumbled from within the cave, sending a fresh wave of dread coursing through her. But before she could back away, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the moonlight with a slow, deliberate grace. Emily's breath caught as she took in the sight, a figure cloaked in darkness, with glinting eyes that reflected the moon like molten gold. She couldn't tell if it was human, beast, or something in between. Its silhouette shifted, the edges blurring as though it were made of smoke and shadow. and yet it watched her with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, a look that went beyond animal instinct. The creature, if that's what it was, stood motionless, its gaze locked on her as though waiting, watching her reaction. She felt a strange urge to speak, to ask it who or what it was, but the words froze in her throat. The whispers from the trees grew louder, almost as if urging her to flee, to escape while she still could. But then the creature did something unexpected. It lowered itself, almost as if bowing, and with a shuddering breath, began to change. Emily's eyes widened as its form twisted and reshaped, limbs elongating, skin rippling in a way that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. She was forced to look away, her mind struggling to comprehend the impossible transformation before her. When she looked back, the figure that stood in the moonlight was no longer a creature but a man. His face was pale, his eyes a familiar shade of amber that still held that otherworldly gleam. He looked at her, a sad, knowing expression in his eyes, as if he understood her terror all too well. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice low and filled with something Emily could only describe as regret. "This place, it is not for you." Emily felt the weight of his words settle over her, a realization dawning on her that she could no longer deny. This wasn't just a myth, a story the villagers told to frighten children. The beast of Black Hill was real, a relic of some ancient past that had been hidden away, waiting, watching. But before she could respond, a loud snap echoed through the woods, a sound that startled both of them. The man's gaze shot past her, his eyes widening with sudden urgency. Without a word, he turned and vanished back into the cave, his figure melting into the darkness as if he had never been there. Emily stood alone, her heart racing, the weight of what she had seen pressing down on her like a leaden cloak. The whispers in the trees grew softer, fading into the background as though satisfied that the threat had passed. She took a shaky step back, her mind reeling, every instinct screaming at her to run, to leave this place and never look back. But as she turned to go, a final whisper drifted through the air, carried on a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Emily's footsteps echoed in the stillness as she made her way back through the forest. Yet each step seemed heavier, slower, as if something invisible clung to her, unwilling to let her leave the secrets of the hill behind. The trees appeared closer, looming, their twisted branches reaching toward her, pulling her back with the weight of all that they had witnessed through ages past. Her thoughts were tangled, snared by the haunting image of the man's eyes, amber and ageless, yet tinged with sorrow. There had been a warning in them, an unmistakable plea to turn back, but what unnerved her most was the strange familiarity she felt as he spoke. It was as though he had known her, as though he had expected her, a notion that twisted uncomfortably in her mind. Was she destined to find him? Was she meant to bear witness to his transformation, his secret life bound to the hills? As she moved, a low fog began to rise around her, swirling like a living thing, winding between her legs, coating the ground in a thick, unnatural mist. She paused, the air suddenly heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth. Her eyes struggled to adjust in the dark, and the silence that filled the forest felt stifling, as though it swallowed every sound before it could reach her ears. Emily took a deep breath, calming herself, but the air felt thin, almost as though it were resisting her, taunting her fear. She glanced around, disoriented, when she noticed something peculiar on the path ahead, a faint outline of footprints in the damp ground, large like the ones she'd seen before, but these weren't heading toward the cave. They led away from it, following a winding path through the trees that she was certain hadn't been there before. Compelled by something she couldn't name, she followed. She tread softly, her footsteps muted, each one a hesitant mark on the ground as she traced the faint path. The forest deepened, and the shadows seemed to thicken around her, pressing in close. Just as she thought she'd lost the trail, she saw it, a one wooden door, barely visible through a curtain of moss, embedded into the side of a hillside she didn't remember passing on her way up. A shiver crawled down her spine as she approached it, her pulse quickening. The door looked ancient, its wood splintered and gray, weathered by time, the iron handle rusted, as though no hand had touched it in years. Yet, as she stood before it, she felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding, as if some force lay dormant just beyond. Tentatively, she reached out, her fingers grazing the rough wood. The moment her skin made contact, a rush of whispers surged around her, rising and falling like waves, their voices urgent, warning her to stop, to turn away. But curiosity tightened its grip, pulling her forward. Her hand closed around the handle, and before she could second-guess herself, she pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell that led downward into inky darkness. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and something else she couldn't place, something metallic and strange. A tremor ran through her, but she took a cautious step forward, descending into the unknown. As she moved deeper, the whispers faded, replaced by a thick, stifling silence that seemed to settle over her like a heavy shroud. Each step echoed in the hollow space, the walls pressing close, almost brushing her shoulders. It felt endless, this descent, as though the stairwell were leading her to some forgotten depth beneath the hill. Finally, she reached the bottom, her foot touching a hard, uneven floor. The air was dense and cool, thick with the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the darkness itself were watching her. She squinted, waiting for her eyes to adjust, and then she saw it, a small, circular room, barely illuminated by a faint blue glow that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves, casting strange, flickering shadows. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, worn and cracked, its surface littered with what looked like fragments of bones and feathers. But what caught her attention most was the inscription carved into the stone, words in an old, faded script that seemed both familiar and completely foreign. Her eyes traced the lines, her mind struggling to comprehend the meaning, when a low growl rumbled from the shadows. Her heart leapt, and she took an involuntary step back, her gaze darting around the room. But there was no one there, nothing but shadows shifting along the walls, flickering in the strange blue light. She held her breath, the air thick with the unspoken weight of something lurking, watching. And then she heard it, a voice, deep and rough, like the growl of an animal, but unmistakably human. "You don't belong here." The words echoed through the chamber, filling the space with a sense of dread that left her rooted to the spot. She scanned the shadows, her heart pounding, as the voice seemed to drift closer, wrapping around her like a cold wind. The shadows coalesced, taking form, and she saw him, a figure emerging from the darkness, his face obscured, yet she knew instantly who he was. It was the man from the woods, his gaze still holding that strange amber glow, but this time it was filled with something else, something darker, more primal. "You should have left when you had the chance," he murmured, his voice laced with a hint of regret. "Now, you're part of it." Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she struggled to make sense of his words, but a growing realization clawed at her mind. She glanced around the chamber, at the strange symbols on the walls, at the fragments of bone scattered across the floor. She understood, then, that this place held more than just the memory of a beast. It was a shrine, a tether to something ancient, something she had unknowingly bound herself to by crossing its threshold. The man stepped closer, his eyes glinting in the eerie blue light, and she felt the walls closing in, the darkness pressing down on her. His voice was barely a whisper now, but she heard it clear as day. "There's no going back, Emily. Not anymore." As the shadows closed around her, she felt a strange calm settle over her, a sense of acceptance mingled with fear. She realized, with a clarity that felt both haunting and inevitable, that she had come seeking answers, but what she'd found was something far darker, something that had been waiting in the heart of the hill for centuries, And now, it had found her. The darkness in the chamber felt thicker, almost suffocating, as Emily's heartbeat slowed, and her senses sharpened to a near-painful clarity. She could see the faint flicker of blue light reflecting off the man's eyes, giving them an otherworldly gleam, a stark reminder of the creature he claimed to be. Yet, in those moments, he seemed entirely human, vulnerable, even. It was a stark contrast to the foreboding presence that had filled the air just moments before. He kept his distance, yet his presence filled the space, commanding it with an unspoken authority. It was as if the room itself responded to him, the shadows shifting, bending to his will. Emily wanted to step back, to retreat from this strange confrontation, but something compelled her to stay, to stand her ground and look directly at him. "Who, or what are you?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling, though she fought to keep it steady. The man's gaze softened, a hint of sorrow flickering in his eyes. "I am what I have been made to be," he replied slowly. "A guardian, of sorts, though my purpose has long since lost its meaning. I was once part of this village, a person like any other, bound by duty to protect it. But protection came with a cost. And so, every year, I return, bound to this place, tethered to its secrets." A chill prickled down her spine as she absorbed his words, piecing together fragments of the local legends she'd heard as a child. Stories of a guardian, a figure neither human nor beast, who roamed the hills to keep them safe. But in every version of the tale, the guardian was always described as something more sinister, a presence meant to frighten children away from wandering too far into the woods. "I thought the stories were just tales," she stammered. "Something to keep us from coming out here." He let out a low, humorless laugh, the sound reverberating through the chamber. "Stories have a way of evolving, twisting with each retelling. But there is truth in every myth, Emily. I am here because the village chose it, because they feared what lay beyond these woods. They needed someone to contain it." Emily took a hesitant step forward, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "And now? Why are you still here, still, bound?" The man's face grew dark, shadows filling the hollows of his eyes as he looked at her. "Because some chains cannot be broken. They hold stronger than any iron, forged by fear and sacrifice." He held up his hands, where faint scars ran across his wrists, as if bound by invisible shackles. "This place, this cave, it is a tether to the past. A reminder of what was given up, of what was lost." Her heart pounded as she listened, a deep, haunting sorrow filling her. For a moment, she saw the faint outlines of another life on his face, a younger man with hopes, dreams, a life beyond these woods. But that life was long gone, consumed by the very curse he now carried. "Why was I drawn here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why was I chosen?" He met her gaze with a sad smile, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. "Because you carry the blood of the village, the same fear that built this place, the same curiosity that has drawn countless others to these woods. You are here because you seek answers, but the answers only bring more questions." The weight of his words settled over her, pressing down on her with a terrible certainty. She could feel the ancient power that lingered in the chamber, the unbreakable ties that bound him to this place. But there was something else, too, a strange, subtle recognition that she shared some part of that connection. As the silence deepened between them, Emily felt a flicker of resolve in her chest, a determination she hadn't known she possessed. She straightened, meeting his gaze with a newfound strength. "Then what do we do now?" she asked quietly. "Is there a way to end it?" His face softened, his expression almost wistful. "Perhaps. But that is a choice that comes with its own cost. To break the bond, to sever the ties, one must accept the burden entirely, to take on the shadows willingly, with all that entails. A chill settled over her, the finality of his words hanging in the air like a heavy mist. She knew, deep down, that he was offering her a choice, a path forward that would change everything. To walk away would mean leaving him in the shadows that haunted the hills behind. But to stay, to accept the burden, meant embracing the darkness, becoming part of the legacy that bound him here. The chamber seemed to pulse with her hesitation, as if sensing her indecision. She took a deep breath, grounding herself, and looked at him one last time, searching his face for some sign, some glimmer of hope that this curse could finally be broken. I need time, she murmured, the weight of her choice pressing down on her. The man nodded, understanding, and stepped back into the shadows, his form beginning to blur, merging with the darkness. His final words echoed through the chamber, a faint whisper that seemed to linger long after he was gone. Time is all you have, Emily. Choose wisely. With that, he vanished into the shadows, leaving her alone in the chamber, surrounded by the weight of history and the heavy silence of the hill's secrets. Emily stayed in the cave long after the man had disappeared, as if his presence lingered there, absorbed into the stone walls. Silence wrapped around her, thick and stifling, and every sound, a rustle, a distant howl, seemed magnified, as if the shadows themselves were holding their breath. She could feel the weight of his words, like a binding etched in stone, echoing in her mind. Time is all you have. Choose wisely. Steeling herself, she began to make her way out of the cave. Each step was hesitant, and the weight of her decision bore down on her like the ancient trees towering outside. By the time she emerged into the open night, the air felt thinner, colder, as if the landscape itself had shifted around her. The forest was cloaked in an almost unnatural silence, as though everything was watching, waiting. The path back to the village wound ahead, dimly illuminated by the faint light of the moon. Yet, something within her tugged, an unyielding pull toward the hilltop where she'd first heard the call. She turned and glanced back at the dark cave entrance, half expecting to see him standing there, a spectral figure bound by ancient duty. But there was only darkness, patient and unchanging. She let herself wander, her feet carrying her up the incline, closer to the ridge overlooking the village. There, under the open sky, the view sprawled out in eerie stillness, the same village, the same homes, every rooftop casting an almost comforting glow. But Emily could feel it now, a boundary between her and them, a separation that hadn't existed before. She was bound to the hill now, somehow more aware of it, more connected to its secrets, as if the choice she thought she hadn't yet made had already been sealed. With a quiet, resigned calm, she sat on the cold earth, staring down at the village lights. They flickered in the distance, safe and oblivious to the ancient darkness that had bound itself here on the hill. She was aware of every small sound now, the stir of the leaves, the creak of distant branches, the low, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath her. It was the presence of something old, as ancient as the rocks and trees that surrounded her, a thing that waited, patient and eternal. The village below lay unchanged, blissfully unaware of the history bound to this place, of the watchers and guardians it had created, or the lonely fate of those who answered the call of the hill. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she could almost feel his hand resting on her shoulder, a brief, cold comfort in the night. And then, somewhere distant, she heard the faintest echo of a howl. It was low and mournful, barely rising above a whisper, yet its resonance stirred her deeply. It wasn't the same as the wild, violent howling that had first drawn her here. This was softer, as if whoever called from the darkness knew her, as if it were not a warning but a summons. Emily rose slowly, a part of her knowing she would return here again and again, compelled by a force beyond her control. She looked down once more at the village, where no one stirred, where the ordinary rhythm of life carried on, blissfully untouched by the strange, otherworldly burden that had claimed her. The choice had been hers to make, but the moment she stepped into the cave, her path had been bound to the hill, to its ancient curse and the timeless task of watching over shadows. With a final glance at the village, she turned and walked into the forest, her steps light yet deliberate. The night deepened around her, folding her into its silent embrace as the distant howl faded, leaving only the quiet rustle of the trees and the steady rhythm of her footsteps. Emily knew she would be back, that the hill had claimed her, and in time, she too would become one of the shadows it kept. She was no longer just Emily. She was the keeper now, bound to the hill, and the darkness had found its newest guardian.